Welcome! This video is about the titanic struggle of attempting what no woodturner in history has ever achieved. A continuous, open, segmented helix. Will he descend into madness or pull off one of the most difficult woodturnings ever? Success is not looking good. And with this project breaking 4 times, madness is looking rather attractive. My name is Ray, and this is Ray Whitby Creations. In part 2 of 3, we're looking at a helix with a chiral angle of 6.6 degrees. That's at the front of the segment, with 12.1 degrees at the rear of a segment 30 millimeters deep. There's 12 segments per helical turn, so a 15-degree miter angle is needed. I strongly recommend that if you're repeating this work, draw out your intended helix in 2D and then double check all measurements. I also suggest putting the formulas into a spreadsheet to automate the process. It'll save a lot of time if you're planning a number of similar projects. I'm using scrap utility wood and pine, and the first thing to do is to plane it down and then to take it to the taper saw to cut the 15-degree miter angle. The plan is for 4 helical turns per different wood type, so a minimum of 48 pieces of each are needed. For more information needed to conduct this project, please watch the other video in this series. This is the how to make this jig for the bandsaw. The varying angle needed for the top and bottom has a non-linear profile, and each angle was calculated at 5mm steps through the segment, which gives the best approximation of the new type of woodworking cut needed to make this project work for the dimensions selected. The top and bottom of each segmented piece was cut on the bandsaw using this jig with the profile shown, and it's best to have a fresh blade when running these segments in order to get high reproducibility. This process is more cumbersome than a compound cut, but vitally important to get the varying chiral angle needed for the project to work. The outside edge of the top and bottom surface of the ring needs a chiral angle of 6.6 degrees and an inner edge of the top and bottom surfaces of 12.1 degrees. With the pine pieces cut, I tape up a complete helix, holding it together with simple masking tape. I just needed to make sure that the alignment of the segments are forming the expected helical turns. If the segments are not continuous, then it will become very much step-like, and it will fail to reach the correct height. And if that happens, it's right back to the start. With the spacer block removed, we have the first helical turn. And the top and bottom surfaces of each segment look to be fairly continuous throughout the helix. I mean, there are some minor issues to be expected, and some of those can come out in the sanding stages if necessary. The pine segments are held together with super glue. It didn't need a lot, just enough to hold it in place, so that it can form the template in which we can then lay the utility segments on top. This next step was definitely mundane, which we had to use some packing tape over the joints between the pine segments. This is vitally important in order to avoid the epoxy resin glue from seeping onto the sacrificial pine template when putting the utility layer together. Naturally, the packing tape used could not be laid around corners, so I had to custom cut every single piece. Well, I've done some projects that involved very tedious tasks before, like routing out 150 plus bow ties into a single vase. And the end result? Well, it is worth it. In order to extend the helix with pine pieces, I used a utility segment as a spacer, then superglued the extra pine pieces to the opened end of the pine helix. Once dried, and using an accelerator here is very useful, the utility spacer can be removed and the process repeated until the entire helix is complete. Applying glue into and across the seam of the pine pieces is obviously going to be a weak bond, and that could have certain implications, as you'll see later. Nonetheless, the structure is fairly robust and certainly enough to be handled. But as the helix grows, so does the taping job. And although it is very tedious, it is important to be able to remove the pine segments from the finer utility helix. It's now time for the epoxy resin gluing of all the utility segments onto the pine helix template. I used a 30-minute cure time glue to allow a bit of time to jiggle those pieces into place. The difficulty with this part of the project, compared with the closed helix I did previously, is that you cannot anchor a segment further up the helix and then apply pressure to all the curing segments in between. And this is mainly why I chose the epoxy resin glue rather than wood glue, because at least it would provide a more robust bond. Now, there may actually be a way to apply pressure easily to this system for construction, but I couldn't figure it out at the time. So if you've got any ideas, please let me know in the comments below. My approach for woodturning the entire system would be to use a sacrificial central column. I would hot glue the helix onto this and then work on the overall form. Now, it didn't have to look pretty, just functional. Only the exposed interface between the segments and the central column were glued, as I needed to be able to remove the column after turning it. The first task in the wood turning was to flatten the end segments and then attach a base. Now, I wanted the last 5 or so segments to be flat on the bottom and just only profiled on the top. It should have made things a bit easier, so I thought. But these extra segments were a bit of an afterthought and decided to jump off. Thankfully, I'm wearing full safety gear and was even able to catch the camera as it fell towards the lathe. After the spontaneous detachment, I became a little apprehensive, so proceeding was very slow work. Decided to nibble away, check the progress, then nibble away some more. Now, perhaps part of the problem with the project was the helical direction. If you looked at it from the tailstock to the headstock, the helix is moving clockwise, which means that you have a cliff face charging onto the tool. So one had to be very careful indeed. And perhaps if it was counterclockwise, things might have been a little bit easier. But that would mean going back to the bandsaw and making a new jig, or learning how to wood turn on the other side and run the lathe in reverse. The light and dark bands of the helix can be somewhat distracted when wood turning, and so it just helps to be able to focus on the tip of the tool and hopefully let that do all the work. With the bottom segments flattened, the helix was removed from the long column and mounted onto an obliging base. The column was then reduced in length, so it would be just short of the base from the open end of the helix, allowing the whole system to be compressed onto the lathe for stability. I had a spare block of utility, so I could keep the same wood throughout the whole system. And here I'm going to use ordinary PVA glue and drying it under compression on the lathe. It didn't need to be perfectly central on the base, as I had enough meat in the segments to turn the whole system true, but it's usually best to aim for accuracy and spare the extra work needed for correction. Only 3 segments of utility were in contact with the base, So it would be a test to see if this was strong enough to drive the rest of the Helix through the wood turning stages. A similar number of pine pieces touched the base, but were only held there through compression. And this should give it some stability. The PVA glue was allowed to dry for 24 hours, then the base was rough cut into a polygon and mounted on the lathe. I needed a rough cylinder for the base, and then I could work on a mortise to mount onto the jaws. With all the prep work done, I can now begin turning the form of the Helix. But all I kept thinking was, just stay away from the open end. Plus, all I had was 3 segments that were glued to the base, and the rest of the Helix was epoxy resin glued only through the sides of each segment. In my mind, it just wasn't a robust system that I'm used to for when wood turning. It created an aura of unpredictability, even though I had reduced the risk as much as I possibly could. So the most damage it could do would probably have a couple of segments break off and hit my face shield. You cannot account for everything, even in wood turning. And behold, another breakage. This time on the pine Helix, which actually I should have expected, mainly because it was just held together with CA glue on top of the joints rather than internally. But these are quickly fixed with some hot glue in the reassembly, and then just to get back onto the wood turning. It's possible that I could have just simply turned the whole thing as a one open segmented piece, but I was determined to have all those pine pieces slotted back in place. It may be difficult to tell, but I did hot glue a couple of segments on the end of each Helix that had been rounded over, and this was to give it a smooth transition of the tool onto the cliff edge of the Helix. Now, it may not have been totally necessary, but by this time I just wanted to assuage my trepidation. And if I wanted to relax, then all I had to do was just watch the pattern spiral away. The form I chose was not too dramatic. It was just to have a gentle curve from a narrow base to a more open end. And once it was turned, the external can be sanded. I started at about 80 grit and went up to 240. Once happy with the sanding that far, I applied sanding sealer, and once dried, then continued up to about 400 grit, where I then used both grades of Yorkshire grit. Everybody has their preference of sanding methodology, and a strong rationale for doing so. I, however, had come up with something that appears to work, and actually leaves a beautiful finish. So, do I need to do more? It would be interesting to have a professional cast their eye over this work in person. So if you're in the southeast of England, why not come and pay me a visit? I bind the external form with masking tape, and then on the outside of that, electrical tape. I've just found it's easier to clean the masking tape from the system. Binding it will constrain the helix so that when processing the internal cavity through hollowing, hopefully nothing will then fly off. I started gently with the hope that if all progressed well, then I could remove a lot of material and have an elegant helical structure. But as you can see, that didn't happen. The helix began to move freely, so I had to stop the lathe, dismantle the steady rest, and then explore. And sure enough, there was a clean break of the helix, but this was quite a few segments up from those that were in base contact. So some of these joints just weren't strong enough. But fairly easy to repair, so I just re-glued it with some epoxy resin glue, and in fact I did hold it under pressure for 5 minutes until it had all set. I waited 24 hours before remounting on the lathe and then proceeding. I decided after a while not to try and remove any more material in the hollowing stage. Maybe it's giving in to fear, But having got this far, with all the issues I'm experiencing, I really wanted to complete this project, and then I can rethink an approach if I ever wanted to repeat it. Now perhaps you've got some great ideas that could help, so please let me know in the comments below. When removing the pine segment pieces, this is where having spent all that time taping everything up actually pays off, because the pine segments can be fairly easily removed from the utility. What's left behind is the epoxy resin glue, where it's dripped from the utility segment joints and pooled, and this will require a major cleanup. Now it may be tricky to see, but the segments line up pretty well at the front and the back before any sanding is done. It shows the varying helical angle cuts done on the bandsaw were correct, resulting in a continuous flow of the helix. For the remainder of the sanding, I used 40 grit, and some of it was done with rotation, and the rest was done when static. It's a rather cool and almost floating effect that results, but it kept kicking the sanding stick away if I strayed too close to the end. To remove the pooled epoxy resin, I turned to a Dremel-like device. Well, this was a cheap knockoff copy we had donated to the charity, but it worked well. The top and bottom surfaces of the segments was then sanded, again starting at around 40 grit and working up to 240 grit. There were quite a few segments that required a bit of work because of the epoxy resin glue. It's probably because I had hit it with the Dremel tool a bit too harshly and caused a minor divot, which then had to be sanded out. It was well over an hour of sanding before I got to the stage where I could apply the sanding sealer. And once dried, it's then sanding till 400 grit and then apply the Yorkshire wax. If anyone thinks that finishing a woodworking or woodturning project is quick, just let it be known that we have untold patience. The tight separation between the helical layers proved a bit of a pain when it came to the final stages, but I did the best I could. And given that the resin glue could still be seen between some of the segments, it wasn't to a high standard that I had hoped for. And I probably could have done better in the cleanup if I had actually used PVA glue. Now this criticism may be unnecessarily harsh, and my standards may be set beyond my capabilities, but it is tough to find a demarcation point as to when perfection becomes the enemy of the good. I opted to go for a simple finish using beeswax so that it would give a satin-like finish, just a nice sheen without it being too glossy. I really wanted the wood to appear in its almost natural, highly sanded state. All that was required is a final polish, and then the project is finished. And this is the final piece, a continuous, open segmented helix, which I don't believe has ever been done before, though if I'm wrong, I'll be more than happy to showcase the original creator. Please let me know what you think of the project in the comments below. For me, despite its many challenges, I really like the way this turned out. The utility has this beautiful chatoyance which really comes alive. The helix is thicker than I had planned, and that's mainly down to my reticence to further risk ripping it all apart. Nonetheless, as a concept piece, this allowed me to demonstrate a potential methodology for others to try and improve upon. I mean, maybe it'll even unleash more creative ideas in the realm of woodworking and woodturning, not previously thought possible. That just leaves me to say thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, please click on like and subscribe, and don't forget to leave a comment below.